Welcome to another parent-teacher video lesson from the earlygiftedmanual.com, a free website for homeschooled children 3 to 7 years old and their parents that promotes and develops giftedness at an early age. I am Gary Blank, the creator of that site, and your host and facilitator for this video and all of the videos in my educational program. As the video lessons are designed to work in conjunction with the program on my website, I ask you to, at some point, click on the URL link in the description box below, and this action will take you to the earlygiftedmanual.com. By doing that, you will be able to put this lesson and all of the video lessons here on my channel in the proper context of the total program that I am presenting to you and your child. So now let's look into what we call standard units of measurement. If you remember, we use the paper clips. I would call those non-standard units, and you'll see why shortly. So we'll be working with a ruler right now for a while in this lesson. And I think before we get started, I mean, obviously I have to address the issue of there is more than one system of standard units for measurement. And of course, as adults, we know that. If you live in the US and some other places, especially English-speaking places, you may be using what's called the US customary system. And that's what I will be using here. And why am I doing that? Because that's the system I grew up with and still use the most. And in spite of all the efforts by many people to get the metric system going, for example, in the U.S., people hold on to this U.S. customary system, which is, of course, a very old. Metric system is much more logical. It's easier to use, especially when you're doing computations with it, but we hang on here in the U.S. with the U.S. customary system. So that's what I'm going to be using. If you live elsewhere where you use the metric system, or if you just want to, if that's how you want to introduce this idea of standard units to your child, you can use the metric system. And you're on your own for that, but it should be very easy to just switch out the different measuring devices we're using with ones that are marked with metrics. All right, I got that out of the way. So we will be measuring some objects that are shorter than 1 foot, and we're going to be using a ruler, and your child will may already know what a ruler is, but now we're going to go into it a little more deeply. What is a ruler? Well, a ruler represents what's called 1 foot, and that is a standard unit of measurement, and we'll talk about that in just a second. And as you can see, these are called inches. Everywhere you could tell your child, everywhere you see a number in this long line, that's 1 inch. And then as you go down the ruler, it keeps adding up the inches for you. There's 1 inch, 2 inches, 3 inches, 4 inches. And it's very important to point out to your child that, look, every inch is the same length. And they should be able to see that just by looking at it. Every inch is the same length. And as you go down the ruler here, 6, 7 inches, 8, and finally you make it up to 12. And a foot is equal to 12 inches, or 12 inches is equal to a foot. You can present that both ways. Of course, that's very important. So we have these new vocabulary words: 1 foot, 1 inch, and of course there'll be, as we get into different measurements, we will get into feet and inches. So keep repeating these vocabulary words, and of course make sure your child repeats these vocabulary words so they get them into their daily usage. So now we must go back into this idea of standard units. Well, what is a standard unit? You can tell your child that anyone who's using this U.S. customary system, and you don't have to present it in that way, just say that anyone who's measuring things, all the measurements agree. In other words, if you have a ruler and your inch is exactly that long, and you could show him, if somebody else is measuring, maybe a mile away or in another household, their inch is exactly the same length. And that's what we mean by a standard unit. And their foot, which is 12 inches, is exactly the same length. And you could kind of show him this by maybe bringing in another ruler that's obviously was manufactured by somebody else. And of course, you know, there's millimeters and inches here. We're only concerned with inches. And you could put it right up to this one and show how, yes, someone may have a ruler like this, you know, 1,000 miles away, but look, the inch is still an inch. It's the same length. And that's very important that your child understands that. And a foot is still a foot. And why is that important? Well, you could give him an example. You could give him an example of, let's say, a group of people want to build a house, and a lot of people are involved in building a house. There is the person called the architect who draws up the plans for the house on paper. Of course, now they do it on computer, but he draws up plans for the house, and he uses these measurements, feet, inches, and other types of measurements. And all the people who work on the house agree that they're going to use the same standard, the same measurements, just like I explained a little while ago. What happens if they don't? Oh my gosh, the house looks crazy. It's not going to get built very well. When everyone agrees on what an inch is and what a foot is, the house goes together beautifully, everything works, and that's why we have standard units. So you can discuss that with your child a little bit, in a way, of course, that he or she can understand. So let's measure a few things with this ruler. And I think we'll start out using the same objects we did earlier in the lesson. Perhaps we'll start with this marker here. And the same principle holds. We line up the edge of the marker with this, I call this a gradation. That's the 0 point on this ruler. So I hold it right there, hold everything steady. And if I look over here, it says 6, and here is what we call the half-inch gradation, and that's going to come in very handy for us because now we don't have to guess where the middle of this inch is, we know. So look, it's a little less than a half, so let's just say this marker is 6 inches long. So we're getting a start here with measuring things with the ruler. All right, let's, I think the next thing we measured is this sponge. So I'll put this sponge down here, and once again line up this 0 point on the ruler, the gradation, with the sponge, and we'll read it over here, and it looks to me like 7, and it's past a half, so let's call it 8. So that is the length of the sponge, 8 inches. Okay, and what is the width? Line it up. Line up the 0 point to the edge. It looks exactly, almost exactly like about 4 inches. So there is a sponge. It is 8 inches long, or 8 inches in length. And then it's customary to say by before you give the other measurement. You can tell your child that. 8 inches long. Let me remember again here. Excuse me, 7 inches long by 4 inches wide. That's how you would say it. Okay, let's see, what else did we measure? A book. Let's start out with the long end of the book. Line it up on the edge. And what does it say over here? 8 and almost 9 inches, over half. So we're going to call it 9 inches long, 9 inches in length by, let's line it up, 7, it's a little less than a half an inch. So let's say 7 inches in width. It's 7 inches wide. And of course you can remind yourself that you're approximating these measurements right now. They're not absolutely, and it isn't important at this time for them to be absolutely right on the money accurate, because we're just learning a concept here. So remember to keep introducing the word approximate. All right. A bigger book perhaps? Here we go. Line up here. It looks like 10 and a little more, but less than a half, so we'll call it 10 inches in length or 10 inches long by, line up, 8 and a little over a half, so let's call it 9 inches wide. So what did I say? 10 inches long by 9 inches wide. And of course we can't forget the third dimension, the depth dimension, or sometimes it's also called the height dimension. You could use either of those. So I brought in the blue sponge again, and my rule, my 12-inch ruler, and a piece of paper, because we're going to actually, I would like, besides doing this with your child, I would like you to record the measurements and give him or her an idea to see what it looks like written out, and of course to reinforce these words: height, depth, width, length. We want to get those words in your child's vocabulary. So here we go. Let's measure this sponge. Let's start out with the length, and it's less than 8, but longer than 7.5. So we're going to round off to inches. So we're going to say 8. So 8 inches in length. And then we're going to use this X, and you could tell your child that X means by. It's going to kind of separate the length from the width here, and that's the convention. That's the way we signify a group of measurements together here of one object. So let's measure the width of the sponge. Of course, line up the edges. I forgot to mention that. We line up the edge right here. And it looks like it's a little bit more than 4, but not quite 4.5. So let's round it off to 4 inches by 4 inches in width. And now let's measure the third dimension of this sponge. I'm going to call it depth. Sometimes you could also call it height. Once again, line up the edges here. And it looks like we have just shy of 1.5. So I'm going to round it off to 1 inch. So I'm going to start out with by, and a new line here because I've run out of space, by 1 inch in depth. So there it is written out, and you can tell your child perhaps another way to say this is instead of in length, 8 inches long, by 4 inches instead of in width, wide, and instead of 1 inch in depth, could say 1 inch deep. And let's say if we were working in heights, you might want to say instead of in height, you could say high. So you can teach your child a simpler and shorter way of recording all this information that you see here on the paper. The measurement we just took, 8 inches in length by 4 inches in width by 1 inch in depth. And of course you can use these words, 8 inches long by 4 inches wide by 1 inch deep. And you can show your child how to simplify and shorten that up considerably through the use of a symbol and some abbreviations. Let me show you what I mean here. Let's start out with this first part of the measurement, and it is 8 inches, and there is a symbol you can use, kind of a shorthand for the word inches, and it looks like this. Sometimes they're on a slant or straight down. That there is a sign for, a symbol I should say, for inches. So 8 inches and long, capital L, period. Some people use lowercase letters. That's okay. I like to use the capitals. So we have 8 inches long by, and we talked about that symbol before. That's kind of a way of tying all the three measurements together. By 4 inches wide. 4. And there's our inch symbol again. I'll show you what it looks like on a slant. By 4 inches wide. Let's use a capital W period for an abbreviation. And finally, by 1 inch deep. 1 inch, and I'll use a capital D period for deep. And of course, if this component of the measurement is height, I'll put that off over here in parenthesis. It would be a capital H period. So it's as simple as that, and obviously it's a much simpler way of writing all this information, a shorthand, if you will, and do whatever it takes to get your child used to reading and writing measurements in this form. Give him as much help as he may need with that. You can dictate some for him to write, and of course the two of you can continue to practice measuring things that are less than a foot. And that's as far as we've gone so far. So the longest measurement, a foot or less. And of course, the gradations on the ruler you're using give you a much more accurate measurement. Let's say you're using a ruler just with just inch gradations. And remember when we measured the sponge here, we measured to the nearest inch, and that's what the gradations are all about. I mean, obviously, you could round off to the nearest foot and say that this sponge is 1 foot, but that's not really accurate enough. Inches are a little better, rounding off to the nearest inch. And of course, you know, as your child improves in measuring, you can start rounding off to the nearest half inch, quarter inch, eighth inch, and on and on and on. And I would like to show you, make another point here, and show you, and of course you can show your child, why why rulers and other measurement devices, as we will soon find out, are so handy and so nice to have. Here's a book that we previously measured, and I'm going to take out one of our color tiles here, which I know are 1 inch long, and you can prove it to your child. Put it right up on the ruler, and yes, look, it is 1 inch. Actually, it's 1 inch square, so it doesn't matter how you use it. It's 1 inch on each side. So you could measure this book in 2 ways. Let's say you wanted to use, let me move the tiles over here. You could use the tiles and, of course, line it up and count out each individual tiles, which is the same as an inch. So 1 inch, 2 inch, 3 inch, 4 inch, 5 inch. As you can see, it's not the fastest, easiest process in the world. 6, 7, 8, oops, 8, and almost 9. So we could call it 9 inches. Well, you can show your child that this is why we have rulers. That's slow. That's a slow way to do things. So let's put them back here. And it's much easier to use a ruler. Line it up, and as you can see, we get the exact same measurement. It's almost 9 inches long, so let's call it 9 inches. So the ruler, a very handy thing that you can use very quickly to measure various objects.